I was reminded of my own past. 50 years ago, I was a student, or a bit more than a student, and I was working with Graham Laver and Rob Webster in Canberra, in Australia. And they'd come up with an amazing idea. We all thought Graham was mad, totally. And he came up with this idea. He said, you know what happens? These pandemics start in birds, migrating seabirds, and they start in China. And all we've got to do is find them and then change the whole agriculture of China. And it'll sort it all out. And this is Graham. I mean, he also did that. He's an amazing scientist. I remember when he did his peptide mapping, I didn't just arrive, and he showed me how to do it. It was great big 50,000 volts, great big plates, and it was a little room he had, and when he got the whole electricity going, like 50,000 volts, and there was this little bit of wood that stopped you coming in. Otherwise, you could walk into and get electrocuted. And but from that, he came up with some amazing data. And from that beginning, the pair of them organised these meetings up in the Great Barrier Reef. And Graham was very interested in birds. And so he organised this trip up to there. And the pair of them, and Jean Downey, were the first ones to come up to isolate the virus from a migrating seabird. And it's from that we developed the whole ideas of emergence of these influenza viruses. I spent a week last week in Alderney, and there were bird migrators, these people who call themselves birdies. They're interested in bird migration. Millions of birds are moving through Alderney on their great migration. It showed to me the power of it, the sheer power and the sheer beauty of it, and the sheer science of it that's underpinning all this. The man in charge held a little bird, about the size of half the size of my watch, actually. He held it carefully in his hand. He didn't want to hold it too long because it's on its migration already. If you hold it, they should be eating, they should be feeding on already. If you hold it back for 10 minutes, it's 10 minutes less feeding. And he held this little thing, he blew it to look at its feathers, and then he said to it, he said, off you go. And he just let it go. And he said, you've got another 1,200 miles to go. That little bird, you see, could hardly see it. It was on its way for another 1,200 miles for this migration. So there's the power of it. But of course, we're dealing here with much bigger birds than that. And I was visiting my daughter in Edinburgh just before Christmas, and we were on the seashore, and some great birds were flying above Gars, these ordinary things, and suddenly one of them came down. And I've seen anything like it in my life. It came super down and down on the ground in front of me and died. And there was its wings, it's like this big. And I thought, oh my God, this has an H5N1. So this was before Christmas. And I think it had. We know it's a neurological disease and not a respiratory disease, but flu was pouring out its mouth. It died on the spot. So it was a lesson to me. I mean, I've had enough of it in theory, but it's a lesson to me in practice, the meaning of this virus, the meaning of migration and the power of it, and how difficult it is to get all these things together. Dickens, I'm going to bring Dickens here because I like Charles. I like his play, The Tale of Two Cities. The beginning of it is an easy, nice quotation: "The best of times and the worst of times, and the season of light and the season of darkness." And I'm going to, in these first few slides, I'll come up with the best of times and the worst of times. And I think what he was saying is, even in the best of times, there's a small bit of worst, and sometimes in the worst of times, there's a small bit of best. So you must never give up one way or the other. He never did Dickens. Now, let me look at this. Let me look at this. It's the first time I've seen it, actually, the first time I've shown it. We're interested in this area, but we're interested in the whole map, since we're all in this together. I'm particularly focused on this Qinghai, this lake that borders on the border of Tibet and China. You have to be politically a bit careful here whether you call it China or Tibet, but to mention both. And I noticed one that, as a Cambridge academic, has been cornered and sued by an MP because in a private meeting like this in Cambridge a few weeks ago, I think, he mentioned this MP as her family been involved in slavery. And now she is suing the university because the private little bit that her family was involved in slavery, they've been living on it ever since, they've been made public. So you do have to be careful what you say, even though it's a private. So here we are, we're in Tibet and we're in the Great Salt Lake. It's big enough, this Salt Lake, to see it from space. It's not as big as the biggest salt lake, but it is, getting near there. But the main point of view of this talk is it's full of migrating birds, full of millions of birds go there. Either they're on the north, they come from north onto it, or they come from the south onto it, or they come from the west on it. It gets the birds on all the flight paths mixed in that lake. So we think that's a major mixing area, and the influenza viruses, like Graham and Rob and Jean Downey found on the Great Barrier Reef, that they migrated all the way down from that sort of area, and then they would go back again, because migrating birds come down, then they go back. So it's a forward movement. So we think that even like recently, some of the H5N1, they would have started mixing a mixing bowl here when they get genetically mixed up. And then their flight paths will either bring them across below here or above, across Siberia, across Russia, into Scandinavia, down across the east part of England, across France, down the coast of France, possibly down the coast of Spain, into Africa. That's a major flight path. And there's another one, the one going down from here all the way down to Australia, and there's an Atlantic one, and there's an American one. So those are the routes on which these viruses will be moving around and will. But that's one thing. One thing is a mixing of these influenza viruses, mixing up their genes. Another thing is a spillover event. So we have to be very careful with the terminology. You can say, where did it start? What do you mean, where did it start? Are you meaning, did they mix and suddenly emerge from here? So you can use the word emergent, but where does it spill over? Because they're going to go for a long time, probably not seeing anyone, these birds. So the question is, what's the spillover event? That is the movement from a bird into a mammal or into a human being. That's what we're interested in. And I'm interested in the spillover event with 1918 flu. There are two competitors, well, there are three competitors really on this theory. And remember, when we talk about COVID, a lot of you are interested in COVID. Well, I am, but I'm not working with it particularly. But with COVID, the argy-bargy, I mean, it happened a couple of years ago. Was everyone arguing about it? Was it created by horrible scientists in America? No, sorry, horrible scientists in China. Or what, you see? Or did it, where did it come from? So this is a living memory. We all lived through this time, day by day, and read about it in the Daily Mail. We kind of know things, but it's still not sorted, is it? Every day someone comes up with yet another theory, mainly from the CIA and MI5 and that sort of thing. We have to mix in all that. It's getting more and more difficult. I'll come back to right at the end. We have to be very, very careful with the way that these things are being handled. The theory that I'm going to explain to you yet again, we've added more information to it, is that these birds came over on this way, and that virus, the H1N1 virus, remember, it's not history lab, because we think it emerged not for the first time, probably for the second time. And I'll show you in a minute, one of the early pandemics, 1839, that was probably H1N1, for reasons that we'll come to. So we think, and we've got good information to back it up, and some scientific papers to back it up, really good scientific papers, that this virus spilled over in France during the First World War. I'll come on to that next slide and explain why we think that and the way of the thinking of what's going on. There's an alternative theory that didn't happen, but it happened in the United States, in the Great Plains of Arkansas, down in the southern parts of the states, Texas, that sort of area. But I said, well, I'm not going to carry on with that idea because I think that's outdated. There's no evidence to back that up. There's certainly no scientific publications. It is, in essence, a GP who awarded his degree to himself, his medical degree, or he bought a medical degree, which you could do in the United States at that time. You just buy things, buy a medical degree, sit so under a pharmacy. He had a pharmacy shop, he had a domestic shop, he had this shop, that shop. He was a senator, he did this, he did that, he did something else. And there were a few cases of flu that year, in 1918. Then he phoned up the CDC because there's quite a lot of flu around. And some of these journalists view that as the first evidence of Spanish flu emerging or spilling over in the United States. And I think there is a bit preposterous, which we can debate it with them. The other idea is that it started here and spilled over in China. And there are people moving towards the First World War, Chinese laborers were employed. But again, there's no scientific publication on that. So I think that's pretty thin. So I hope to convince you that when you think again about the Spanish flu, and it did kill 100 million people or more, that it is European, not Spain, but England and France. Let me get in slightly more detail. If you look, this is the hospital centres on the Western Front in March 1918. What you have to realise before you grasp all this is that England was the superpower. The United States was nothing, absolutely nothing. I'd say you could buy degrees in the United States. It had a bit of science going, but not much. England had everything. It had chemistry. The only nation to slightly put England aside was Germany, which had the chemistry right. But everything else was English. We controlled the seas, the oceans, we controlled everything. No one could move on this planet with the British Empire unless we said so. So there's no reason to start thinking, oh, I think this emergence of the 1918 flu, oh, it must have been America. Because America was not like that. America only became big after the First World War. And it used the money, created money from the First World War, and then built on that money in the Second War, became a super. But at the time we're talking about here, it's England. And what England decided to do was move half its medical staff and half its nursing staff from England to the Western Front. That's half it. The number of beds, and these are some of the areas where it has the huge camps, Bologna, Etaples, Cailleux, Le Troupeau Dieppe. The two I'm going to just touch on are Etaples and Rouen. And they had 20,000 beds, in fact, 30,000 beds in each of them. Now, the total number of beds in these hospitals exceeded today's National Health Service. So I think 200,000 beds were set up in that area. That is huge. And that expertise, these people working there were not nobodies. They were all the famous scientists of Britain. Alexander Fleming, just to give one example, was working here at Rouen. He's working on gram-negative bacteria, which is why he was so captivated with this penicillin. Not because he'd ever thought it would be used. He used it in the laboratory to hold back gram-positives and staph and strep, which were overgrowing from the clinical samples, the gram-negative, which he thought was the interesting one. He wanted something to hold back the gram-positives, give an emergence of gram-negatives, work out what caused flu. So that was Fleming. So people working, top quality people working all these places. So I want you to kind of really understand it. So here's the Western Front. They were way back, these things. They could not be, at the beginning, before bombing, they couldn't be bombed, but they could later on be bombed, and they were almost squashed when the Germans in the last months started moving westwards. But that's the way of it on the Western Front. Now, the two important papers are these, and I want to just slightly dwell on them because of the characters in them. This paper was published in 1917 in the Lancet, and you'll see that they're first of all, it's censored. It's censored here, horribly censored. You couldn't work out where this was coming from. They published it in Lancet, but you couldn't, it had no address. And when you worked it out, I sent my students chasing it, and they only worked it out because they went through the obituaries years later. This took them ages. Of Shaw, for example. Shaw turned out to be a very important person. And when he died, they had the obituary in the Lancet 30 years later. And they wrote in the obituary that he made his fame in the First World War about the Spanish flu, and he did it in Etaples. And Etaples was one of the big bases. So for the first time, in my knowledge, we all started talking about Etaples. What the hell is it? And so we soon found out, and I soon found out a historian, Douglas Gill, who lived in worked ever since, who's an expert on Etaples. That's been his life, working out when the camp was built, who built it, why they built it, what they did there. 100,000 soldiers a day would come through Etaples. It was not small, it was huge. I mean, when you think of my own hospital, we've got 1,000 beds. Most of all London, that's big, it's big. But this had 20,000 beds in Etaples. And they needed it, not for Spanish flu, what they did later on, but they needed it for wounded soldiers, and that was at the crux of the matter. So Shaw, and they were drafted into the army. They were not just ordinary army doctors. I mean, my friend's an army doctor, and it's just ordinary compared to what these were doing. So Shaw was a morbid anatomist, and he's highly qualified and with experience. He's a lieutenant. Roland was not so qualified. Hammond, not so bad. And everything really depended in those days on whether you were a captain, a lieutenant, or what you're. And every year they became higher up in the hierarchy. You can see that in their publications. So that was an important thing where they picked up this bronchitis. Now, I want to make it clear that this was the official title of flu. It was called epidemic bronchitis up until about 1918. Sometimes people use the word flu, but more or less they're using epidemic bronchitis. So if you do a computer search with flu and think you're going to pick up something like this, you won't pick it up because the title is purulent bronchitis. But to the people working at the time, that's what it meant, flu. Shaw had a big career. And it's very important in this discovery because, but hidden in that Lancet paper and hidden from this is the most senior author because he didn't put his name on the paper. And he's a general. He was the one who came along and said, I think we need something doing, but this looks serious, this outbreak of coronavirus in this camp. If this were to get out and spread in the British Army, we'd be done for. We've got to do something about it. And he was doing a lot. They were moving around. He was moving around every day around these tens of thousands of beds. And there were all these hospitals trying to work out hygiene, social distancing, and all that sort of stuff. That was going on in the background. But it's he who recommended that Shaw, a morbid anatomist, should be brought into the team. He should start just doing autopsies on everyone who died. Everyone who died were not wounded. So you know, people were dying of other things, and that's where you would pick up something like this, some infection. And then it was only when they did the autopsies, they realized how prevalent this epidemic bronchitis was in that camp. So that was his role. The other team were working independently of this lot. They were working at Aldershot Barracks. Abrahams, he's known because of his brother in this film, going around one of the Cambridge colleges. I forget what the name of the film was now. So he's known for his brother. Hallow's a very well-named published Youngs. Eyre, published, and particularly French down here. He became physician to the king, and he was a diagnostic physician, and he published a classic diagnostic differential diagnosis. There was no such thing until French introduced it. That is, you don't just run into a case, you sort it out step by step. And that's what he did. And that's still differential diagnosis used today to talk about what you've got. And then he wrote the main text of the pandemic report. So big. When by 1919, censorship had dropped because they were able to publish what they wanted. So he published his paper about epidemic bronchitis, purulent bronchitis, and flu. And he says in the introduction, this is influenza. And the stuff we've been talking about that we published on in 1917 is the same infection that we're seeing now in 1919. It is the infection of the pandemic flu. It is pandemic, but we discovered it 2 years ago. That's what he's saying in his first lines of his paper. Now, just touch on this. I was given this book, I forget who gave it to me now. It's a nice book, Epidemic Catarrhal Fever, 1830, 1849. So that's the outbreak of the 1830s. There was another outbreak of influenza in 1889, and then there was an outbreak in 1918, of course, and so on. So I think probably this was H1N1, and that could give the reason why no one over the age of about 40, or certainly elderly people in Britain and the world, didn't die in 1918 because they had some immunity. They had immunity from a previous outbreak, and that was probably this one. So all these things have to come into play. They did an amazing thing, that group. I would really honour them and admire them for it, especially those on the Western Front. I mean, it's easier to be in Aldershot Barracks, but to be on the Western Front in the conditions that we know existed there, and thinking, look, we're going to make a vaccine. I know what it would be like. The rest of the hundreds of medical people still say, what the hell are you doing? Making the vaccine? We've got 10,000 soldiers coming with legs on, and you're fiddling around making a vaccine. So you can imagine the push and the threat on about this, but they carried on. And they made a vaccine. what was in the vaccine? They appreciated these soldiers. They weren't too sure the cause at that stage. They knew they were picking up something. They knew they died of superinfection bacteria. So probably at least half of them. So they put the superinfection bacteria in the vaccine. So at least they could reduce the number of deaths. They put streps in, staph in, Haemophilus influenza in this formulated vaccine. So they were the first, I think. The Australians came pretty hot on it, made millions of doses, started immunizing people. And so did Dr. Eyre on that publication before. He started immunizing Canadian troops with it. But by the time they were thinking of using a vaccine into general publication, things were it was just typical with these politicians. They were hot on it during the time, then they lost interest in it. I'm going to come back to that very important thing in a moment. There it is. It's just a tablet. As far as the eye can see, for 80 miles, this stretch in 80 square miles, this camp. It's one camp. It's not like the campus here, it's like the whole of Oxford. And that's the thing, that's the situation we're working in. Tents and tents and tents and wood and wood and wood and wood. So, and this is what it's like. I've seen hundreds of pictures of Etapla and these camps, and they're all official ones, and not like this. All the official ones have got two nurses, women nurses, standing at the head of a camp there, and all the soldiers lying in bed. That's the official picture. The reality is that, piled on top of each other, there's been an attack on the site or whatever. They all come in, millions of them, all over the place, complete and utter chaos. That's the sort of environment they were working in. This woman, Vera Britton, she was working there as a voluntary nurse. So was a woman more esteemed, certainly by me, than Vera. Vera went through it all, almost. It shows the power of mothers, less power of daughters. Her mother, her very middle class, her mother in Oxford, I think, said, look, you must come back. You volunteered for it. Now I want you back to help me because we can't get any servants. I want you back, Vera. You can't what you were doing on Etapla. She didn't want to do it, but she was forced by her mother to leave her work at Etapla and go back. And she wrote a poem. I'll just read it to you. It's called Epitaph on My Days in Hospital. She wrote it in 1919. So I found in you a holy place apart, sublime endurance, God in man revealed, when mending broken bodies slowly healed my broken heart. And her heart had been broken by her brother who had been killed on the Western Front, and then her fiancé. So she's saying that at Etapla, all those things, all the horror that she went through helped her. This is like Charles Dickens, the best of times. Now, after all that, so you can see, I want to come back to this where it all started. Olsen is a very good epidemiologist, and so is Simonson. This is a good team. And they published a paper, Epidemiology Evidence of an Early Wave of 1918 flu in New York City. And they said the Kansas hypothesis, that's the one about the GP who's his own degree, as he wrote it, running his chemist shop and lots of things. It is, as he politely put it, lacking in vigorous evaluation. Now, that's not what I would say, tell a load of nonsense now. But they're saying that, and they're very polite. These findings, he suggests, their findings here, real the possibility that the virus has spread from Europe to New York in the context of treatment. So that fits in exactly with our hypothesis of origin. And he makes the two important points that anyone with any sense would make. He described the features of the outbreak in 1918, that as youth. That's the unusual thing about it. The people who died were young. And it's a thing he picked up here from the evidence from New York. That's just surprisingly about it. Flu killing young people. And the second thing he picked up is the heliotrope cyanosis, when they went blue color. That's two differentiation. Without that, any information is useless. And that's why, again, our man in Kansas, wherever it was, he didn't say how old these people. We got the impression they were elderly, not young people. Again, that wouldn't be pandemic. See. So you've got to have the evidence, and he has had the evidence, went through all the records and come to a conclusion. There's the boat. We've researched that. Douglas has researched that all during the war, surprisingly. In spite of the U-boats, the Dutch America line was running boats. This is the Noorda, backwards and forwards. And they carried medical and nursing staff for one. And they carried medical and nursing staff from it out for another. And here's just a few of them. We've documented. These are, you won't see the details, but I just tell you the essence of it. Doctors and nurses, we know them when they were in Etaples. We knew when they left Etaples. We knew when they arrived back in New York. So what we're proposing now is a possible link, a physical link between what was going on in Etaples, and more than that now, so I'll explain that, what was going on the Western Front, with all those millions of young people talking. And this is not just a back party, this First World War. 4 million soldiers were involved. So something really big, something big was happening. And now then we've got the link between the outbreak in Europe and the United States. Before the United States, America came into the outbreak. Of course, in Italy, of course, no, I'll leave that definitely. I just want to do one other thing before I get back to the final part of the talk, which I'm not running too bad on time. Grenfell was a graduate of the London Hospital, so we're always keen on him. And he was a missionary, a medical missionary, and he went to Labrador. And it's just best of times, worst of times. This is a little bit in the Octac. There were photographs a year before the pandemic. It is overcrowded. I mean, there are 8 people living in this little shack here. No doubt about it. Characteristic, unfortunately, and I'm sorry for the gruesome story about to unfold here, are with husky dogs. I don't know if you ever come across a husky dog. I went on that one place there, and they put you on the stage. I mean, they are like huge, like small ponies. And they'll knock you over and eat you as soon as they look at you. And that's what happened here, unfortunately. Influenza entered the camp at Octac. The young people died of influenza. Probably a quarter. There were 200 people in that area. The igloos and there were hunter-gatherers still, and one or two missionaries around. They began to die of flu, young people. That meant there was no one to do anything. That meant they couldn't get water because you had to dig out 30 feet. It was frozen stuff. We're talking about elaborate. They had to dig for water. They had to light fires every day, which would freeze to death, and everything else. Without the younger people, they couldn't do that. So they began to die, and the dogs began to eat them. Basically, there was a single survivor. I've taken the picture of her away. A single survivor of that outbreak, and she was 6 by the time, and she barricaded herself in that little hut with her brother, and she was guarded by a husky dog. The lead husky dog guarded her. So when all the others tried to burst their way into the thing to eat her, and he fought them off. And then her brother strayed from. She had under a partner first. He strayed, and they grabbed one of the dogs, grabbed him. So he'd gone. By the time the rescuers arrived, 3 months later, she was a single survivor of this. 30 years later, 40 years later, she described it. I was on a television thing with her. So it was an awesome description of this survival in these circumstances. Contrast that with an outbreak that a group of people I worked with, Mary, particularly, she helped me. She was dead interested. She was a historian, an amateur, and she helped research influenza in a little village in Flintshire. This is it. Same time, as we're talking about in where all was 100% mortality. Here, not much. You couldn't tell that there was a pandemic. She was, just to give you an example of Gwen here, she was writing to her parents, to her mother every day in the morning. The letter would be delivered by the postman in the afternoon. This is how things were functioning. Functioning perfectly in an ordinary way in the middle of the flu. And so they would say, I'm not feeling very well. Dad's not very well either. I've seen blue light in the middle of the night. I hope things are fine, love, Gwen. And 3 days later, she was dead. So in all that, she died quietly at home. And not so long ago, I met a very famous neurologist at the London Hospital, and he was a medical student at the time. And I said to him, what's it like? What's it like in London? And his answer, I didn't know anything was going on. He said, I didn't notice the pandemic. I just came in every morning as a student. They said, go to Wardston. So I went to Wardston and then I noticed it. So it's very difficult to get a grip. We know we've got the dead, we've got the bodies, but what happens in society? And there's not been much written about it, not by proper novelists. There's a lot of journalistic stuff, but not by proper novelists. Only about 3 novels written about it. It's very difficult to grasp it, I think, even all these years later. So I'm going to use Shakespeare in the final bit here. This Hamlet, Act 1, Scene 4. Something is rotten in the state of Denmark. And a friend of mine asked me, he said, as he was typing it out for me, he said, well, why Denmark? Why is he writing Denmark? I said, well, what he means is England, but he can't say England, because in the time of Elizabeth or James, they would have his head. If he writes things like that about his own country, they chop it, basically chop them and set fire to it. So if you set this play somewhere else and you set it in Denmark, something's wrong in the state of Denmark. But what he meant was something's wrong in the state of England. Now, with this in the background, I'm sorry if I'm going to upset anybody here. I suddenly realised I've written with 11 other people for Britain's first pandemic plan. We published it in '93. The 12. It's not a bad plan. Stages of it into pandemic, new virus coming up. Not that at all. And then there was all the goings on, writing further plans and getting everyone ready for a pandemic. I spent a lot of my time. I lectured to everyone in Britain, the public health people, local services, army, the British Army, on pandemics. And the whole country, in a way, was, I think, alerted. The pandemic means storing stocks away of antivirals, analgesic, antibiotics, PPE, a lot of PPE, distributed all around, and so on. But of course, there was one thing we didn't count on. I should have put that on that slide. There's one elephant in the room, and when you think of this as a state bomb, and that is austerity. So while we were continuing doing our science and building up things, the politicians were dismantling it from the back. All the PPE was dismantled, distributed around, used up, and all the plans were kind of went to nothing, actually. So that's how the outbreak started. It was nothing that happened for the previous 10 years. And I've noticed recently at this investigation, that's why it's serious, they brought in that man, Osborne, and they said, well, what about austerity? Didn't that have an effect? 10-year austerity? Oh, no, he said, no, it didn't have any effect at all. That didn't affect the pandemic. Now, that's something we have to be very serious. We really do. Kind of politicians who really don't know what we're doing, and that's not good enough. So where are we going to go from here? I've read this paper here, I'm partly on it because of Jeff Toenberger. We're working together on it. Influenza genes, virus genes in Europe. I'm very pleased to say that everyone's taking an interest in this now and looking in their archives. Not too soon, because these archives are being destroyed. Pathology is being destroyed everywhere, including my own hospital. So you can get information from pre-pandemic, pre-1918, probably from 1889, possibly from 1839. There's certainly not bodies that have been exhumed in lead coffins from 1839, not back in it. So there will be the possibility of doing something about these early outbreaks and understanding more carefully exactly what's happening. I spoke to Jonas Salk, must have been 15, 20 years ago now. We were at a meeting, an HIV meeting. Shane Martin here reminded me, actually. and Salk, of course, made the flu, he made the polio vaccine. And this is it. This is the polio board. And we sat down in this very famous restaurant in Washington. And he said, what's your virus sound? What's your influenza virus sound like? He said, every virus has a noise. And I thought, what are you talking about? Are you going to see now or what? And I said, well, I don't know, really. Maybe a sound coughing, or I don't know, not much. I said, well, what was your virus sound? What's your virus sound like? What's your polio virus sound? So there you have it, two sounds for the podium. One is the hissing of the iron lungs, right? As you went in. And the other one was children crying. Because they're either frightened they're going to die, or they've seen other people die, or they're in pain in that ward. So half of them died in the iron lungs as they were being treated. And I think we have to think carefully about that, because it seems to me half the people with COVID-19 died in their iron lung. So there's a lot to do. And this austerity undermines everything. It really does. It means chopping away at things, public health structure, institutes, and so on, that would help us. We've got to ensure that they're not going to tear up our work. Finally, we have to deal with this. I'm sorry to say. This is a portrait in Edinburgh of the three professors: the professor of anatomy, the professor of physiology, and the professor of biochemistry. They look, and I've had a word with the answer about, they look like scurrilous nobodies. That's what they look like. They look like rats, but they're not. They're famous scientists doing their best. But this is how people begin to view science, a scurrilous activity that we shouldn't be indulging in. And then the final point, I'm going to put an optimistic end, thinking of Charles Dickens in his best of times and the worst of times. The go down. This is the window, the pandemic window we've got in the library of the medical school. It's that one I want you to concentrate on. That's Harold Wilson, the white heat of science and technology. The white heat, that was his view. The white heat, that's why I invested in. The white heat of science and technology will get us out of any hole if we concentrate. I think that too. Thank you.